When Major Dick Winters joined the Army in 1941, he did not intend to become a hero. His goal was just to serve the required year of military service and then get out of the military. But shortly after he joined in 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and Winters found himself leading what would become one of the most legendary units in military history, which is Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which is today known as the Band of Brothers. There's an incredible HBO miniseries that was made in 2001 that covers the story of the Band of Brothers. So that's an absolutely fantastic miniseries. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's absolutely incredible. It was based on a book that Steve Ambrose wrote called Band of Brothers, and then the HBO miniseries was made. And then after that series was released, Dick Winters and Easy Company got a lot more attention. And this book is what Dick Winters wrote and published in 2006, which is his personal memoir that tells the story from his perspective. And I love these books that are autobiographies. One of my favorite books that I've covered on the podcast so far is Sam Walton's Made in America book, because it is an autobiography. And you get to listen to these guys and hear them teaching you the lessons that they learned along the way and telling you the stories from their life so that we can learn those lessons. And as I read these books and as I study for these podcasts and prepare for the podcasts, I'm always trying to think through, hey, what are the questions that I'm trying to answer? What are the questions that I'm trying to find the answers to by putting the time into reading these books and breaking them down and extract the lessons? And normally it's, what can we learn about human nature? What can we learn about leadership and how groups of humans can come together to accomplish a mission or accomplish a goal? So that's what we're going to be studying today, is some of the leadership lessons learned by Dick Winters through his time in the European theater of World War II and the lessons that he deemed worthy enough to pass on. And there's a really great chapter at the end of the book. It's called Reflections, where he's kind of done telling a lot of the stories from the book and he dives into the leadership lessons. And so here we go, diving in on the book. He says, "Was I a successful leader? They tell me I was, and modesty prevents me from disagreeing with them. I am not so naive that I don't realize that the wide appeal of Dick Winters today is based on leadership in combat. I may not have been the best combat commander, but I always strove to be. My men depended on me to carefully analyze every tactical situation, to maximize the resources I had at my disposal, to think under pressure, and then to lead them by personal example." And so I'm going to pause right there because I think that highlights why he studied so hard and why he wanted to be a good leader, because he realized that his men depended on him. And I think that's a really interesting thought to realize. A lot of these people who we study who become great leaders, yes, we've covered, some wealthy people like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos. And yes, some of those people had the goal early on to become extremely wealthy or to accomplish these really big missions. One of the things I think is fascinating about characters like Dick Winters is that they were not dead set on being these incredible leaders or successful people by whatever measure from the get-go. Really what his motivation was he realized that there's this group of guys that depended on him to make the right decision, to make the tough calls, and he felt that it was his responsibility to perform that duty, and that's why he became a leader. And I think it's fascinating to study these different types of leaders because they approach these things from different angles. And so that's Dick Winters, is he sees it as the responsibility or the burden that's been put on his shoulders to be a leader in this situation. So going back to the book, I'm going to rewind and read that sentence again. It says, "My men depended on me to carefully analyze every tactical situation, to maximize the resources I had at my disposal, to think under pressure, and then to lead them by personal example. I always felt that my position was where the critical decision had to be made. Nor am I ashamed to admit that fear was a principal factor that contributed to my success as a leader. I was always afraid of letting my men down, and I was always afraid of dying." We've talked about that before on the podcast, how fear is a normal feeling. And we can see Dick Winters here, one of the most legendary combat leaders in military history, is talking about how he was always afraid of dying. Back to the book. It was a combination of these fears that drove me to learn everything I could about my profession so I could bring as many of my men home from war as possible. So that is what we're going to be studying today, is some of the leadership lessons that Dick Winters learned because he saw it was his responsibility to take care of the men in easy company and bring as many of them home as possible. So the way we're going to approach this podcast is we're going to touch a little bit on his childhood so we can get an understanding of who Dick Winters was, what his childhood was like. Then we'll get into a little bit of the military training. If you've seen the HBO series, there's a guy who's actually played by Ross from Friends. I think his name's David Schwimmer or something like that. But the guy who plays Ross from the TV series Friends, he plays a guy named Captain Sobel in Band of Brothers and in the series. And he's a great example of how not to lead. So we'll cover a little bit of that, but really that section of the book could be its own podcast on its own. And then after we go through some of that, we'll talk about the lessons from a few of the stories that Dick Winters talks about through the invasion of Normandy and then the Battle of the Bulge. So that said, I'm barely going to hit the wave tops of this book. I highly recommend you buy the book or check out the audiobook. That's what I did. I listened to the audiobook. It's a fantastic read. It's fantastic stories along the way, and you're not going to regret it. And like I said, in this podcast, I'm just going to be hitting the wave tops of the book. So diving in on his childhood, Dick Winters was born in January of 1918, and he was born in Pennsylvania. And his childhood, he moves around a little bit within Pennsylvania. And here we go, diving in on the book. He writes, "What I recall most vividly from my youth was that I was scared to death to go to school and of the strangers around me. By the time I attended junior high school, I had finally adjusted to my changing environment and began to exhibit some leadership talent. The school's principal took a liking to me, and I became a school crossing guard." So he's getting a little bit of responsibility here in junior high school. Back to the book. It says, "I guess this was the first time that I was in a position to exhibit any leadership. Reading and geography were always my favorite subjects." And we're going to see this. He reads a lot. And we've talked about this with previous people on the podcast. Reading is extremely important. Naval says that reading is one of the primary factors of his success. And here we see Dick Winters is a big reader. He says it many times throughout the book. Back to the book. "I was an average student academically and enjoyed high school athletics, particularly football, basketball, and wrestling. My dad worked as a foreman for Edison Electric Company. For $40 a week, Dad labored tirelessly to provide for his family and to ensure we had the necessities of life. He was a good father who frequently took me to baseball games in Philadelphia and in the neighboring communities. I had a wonderful mother, very conservative. Honesty and discipline were driven into my head from day one. Not surprisingly, Mother was undoubtedly one of the most influential people of my life. A mother takes a child, she nurtures him, she instills discipline, and she teaches respect. My mother was the first one up every morning. She prepared breakfast for me and my sister Anne, and she was the last one to bed every evening. In many respects, she was the ideal company commander, and subconsciously, I'm sure I patterned my own leadership abilities on this remarkable woman." So that's a little bit about his parents and about his mother. So it's awesome to hear that he's learning some of these leadership lessons from his mother. He ends up going to Franklin and Marshall College, diving back into the book. "While going to school, I naturally did a great deal of reading." Here he goes again, mentioning the importance of reading. "The subjects ran from poetry and literature to philosophy, ethics, religion, sociology, psychology, and all the other subjects associated with a liberal education. To defray college expenses, I earned money for tuition by cutting grass, working in a grocery store, and what might have been prophetic of my future career with the paratroopers, painting high-tension towers for Edison Electric Company." So we can see already he's getting after it in college. He's got to pay for his college expenses. So he's cutting grass, working at the grocery store, and then following in his father's footsteps, working at Edison Electric Company. Back to the book. "Studies, work, and an ever-present lack of funds did not provide much opportunity for running around, but I did have a great deal of time to spend with my inner thoughts and ideas stimulated by reading." And that's something that we see over and over throughout the book, even as they're going through the campaign in Europe, is Dick Winters spends a lot of time detaching himself and letting himself think through the thoughts in his head. So he's reading a lot, but then he also does take the time to say, hey, I need to go on a walk. And he'll go on a walk and take time to clear his thoughts out. And he talks about how often it's during that time where the answers become very clear for what you need to do. So it's really interesting to see how he's doing that early on and talking about how he's doing it in college, and then later on in his military service and during the campaign in Europe, you see him continue to put that into action. And so after he finishes college, here we go, he's going to talk about why he joins the military and how he's thinking. Back to the book. It says, rather than having the draft interrupt a promising business career, I immediately volunteered for the U.S. Army. Under the Selective Training and Service Act recently enacted by Congress, each man was required to serve 1 year of military service. It was my intention to serve my time and then be free of my commitment to the military. So pausing right there, that's what I was talking about at the beginning. He entered the military with the intention to serve his time and do his 1 year and then be done with it. Back to the book. My official entry date was August 25th of 1941. Though I felt a strong sense of duty, I had no desire to get into the war currently raging in Europe. I preferred to stay out of it, and I was hoping the United States would remain neutral. Volunteering for military service was merely the quickest way to rid myself of compulsory service. I had already decided not to volunteer for anything, to do the minimum work required, and to return home to Lancaster as soon as my year was up. So not only was he joining the military only for the minimum year, he was going in with the intention to not volunteer for anything and just do the minimum amount that he needed to do to get through it. So that's his plan before he goes into the military. Back to the book. It says, as the day approached for me to join the Army, I expressed my intention to just pass my time to my foreman at Edison Electric, who was a former military man. He jumped on me and told me in no uncertain terms to do my very best every day and not to become a slacker. In the years ahead, I sent him a note through my father and thanked him for straightening me out. So I thought that was a really cool story. He goes and tells his foreman at Edison Electric his plan to just go under the radar for his 1 year in the military. And it's really interesting to see the impact that one person's words or comments can have on someone in the trajectory of their life. And that's what happened with this foreman at Edison Electric Company. He completely turns around Dick Winter's thinking before going into the military, saying, hey, if you're going to go do this thing, do it to the very best of your ability. Do your best every single day. And that's going to change Dick Winter's trajectory during his time in the military. So now we're going to transition a little bit into the training. And while he's in the Army infantry training, he's going to see the airborne troopers and he's going to be drawn to them. And this is what's going to lead him to volunteer to be a paratrooper. So here we go, diving in on the book. After 10 months of infantry training, I realized my survival would depend on the men around me. Airborne troopers looked like I had always pictured a group of soldiers: hard, lean, bronzed, and tough. When they walked down the street, they appeared to be a proud and cocky bunch, exhibiting a tolerant scorn for anyone who was not airborne. So I took it in my head that I'd like to work with a bunch of men of that caliber. The paratroopers were the best soldiers at the infantry school, and I wanted to be with the best, not with the sad sacks that I had frequently seen on post. And I love this part because it reminded me of something that we talked about on the Steve Jobs podcast. And he talks about how A players like working with other A players and they do not like working with other B and C players. And what that makes me think about is if you are building a team and you want to attract the best talent, you want to make sure that you maintain an extremely high standard for the people who are within your organization so that other people are attracted and want to be a part of that team. And the best people out there want to come and work for your team. And so I just love this story from Dick Winters. He says, hey, the reason I went and volunteered to be a paratrooper is because I saw the airborne troopers in training and they looked squared away and it looked like they were the guys that I would want to be standing next to me while in combat. And so that's what is going to trigger him to then go volunteer for the airborne troopers. So I just love that story from Dick Winters. Now we're going to move on to a little bit of the lessons from Captain Sobel. So Captain Sobel was in charge of Easy Company. And like I said, if you've seen the miniseries Band of Brothers, you already know that Sobel is not a good leader. And so as I think about this section, there's the book and the phrase from Charlie Munger where he says, all I want to know is where I'm going to die so that I don't go there. And what that reminds me of is inversion, right? If you want to understand what it looks like to be a good leader, it's worthwhile looking at the inverse. Hey, what are the traits of a bad leader? And just make sure you don't do that. That's what Charlie Munger's means when he says the phrase, all I want to know is where I'm going to die so that I never go there. You could change that to, all I want to know is how to be a bad leader so I don't do those things. I don't do those things that lose me leadership capital. So here we go. We'll dive into some of the stories from the book about Captain Sobel. This is Dick Winters talking. He said, I've always felt that for the eyes of the enlisted man, a junior company officer should try to be a reflection of his company commander. Actually, I'm going to pause right there. That's a really interesting line. He's talking about how if you are a subordinate leader and you have people, you're kind of like the middle management layer. You have people below you, but you also are reporting to a senior officer within your group. You should try to be a reflection of that, in this case, a company commander. You should try to be consistent. You want your leadership team to be a united front in front of what Dick Winters is calling the enlisted guys. That's, the lower ranks within the military. So all this leadership should try to be consistent. It should try to be a reflection of the company commander. I think that's a really interesting and good point. Back to the book. Easy Company's junior officers found that they simply could not emulate the image of Sobel and live with themselves. Sobel was not just unfair, he was plain mean. As time went by and the pressure shifted from the training of the citizen soldiers to proving and testing of the leadership in the company, Sobel started to wilt and his disposition grew increasingly impossible. In a bad mood, he could go down a line of men during an inspection and find 5 or 6 dirty stacking swivels or weapon slings in a row. Then he might switch to finding 3 or 4 soldiers with dirty ears. A man could not pass inspection if Sobel had a grudge against him, and it seemed that our company commander held many grudges. So when I'm reading this, I'm just thinking about, this is a great example of how to expend leadership capital for useless things and just lose leadership capital with your teams. Sobel is going through these inspections and trying to catch guys with anything and everything that he can find, all the way down to dirty ears. And it's no wonder that the guys are losing respect for him every single day. Here we go. Here's another story about Sobel. Never an admirer of his company commander, Christensen remembered one incident when Sobel viciously humiliated a soldier whose principal crime was nothing more than it was his turn to be the object of the company commander's scorn. Once, during a routine inspection, Sobel was standing in front of Private First Class William Dukeman, a model soldier. Dukeman was a strapping 6 1 inch well-built trooper. His uniform was always immaculate, yet Sobel stood there and continued to scrutinize Dukeman. Then suddenly Sobel thrust his face within inches of Dukeman's face and in a normal tone asked, "What size shirt do you wear, soldier?" Dukeman replied, "Size 15, sir." With a scowl on his face, Sobel shouted, "Damn it, I can put 2 fingers between your neck and your shirt." Dukeman merely responded, "Yes, sir," as Sobel quickly moved to the next man and found similar fault with him. So here we go. We can see Sobel just trying to find things that the guys did wrong during the inspection to establish his seniority or his authority over the guys. And he thinks that it's building him leadership capital when in reality, it's just losing him leadership capital. And the guys are losing their respect for Sobel day by day. And Easy Company is going to fly to the United Kingdom. So 9 months before they end up actually going and performing the D-Day invasion of Normandy, they are in the UK. So they're still continuing their training over there, getting ready for war. And so this next story about Sobel is going to happen while they are in the UK. Here we go, diving in on the book. It says, whereas the punishment he administered in the States was often mean and degrading, in England the punishment passed the point of normalcy to outright cruelty. If a man was late getting back to camp, instead of extra kitchen police duty, he had to dig a 6 foot by 6 foot pit with his entrenching tools at night after the day's training. When the soldier finished, Sobel would tell him to fill it up, Our commander's inability to make decisions, coupled with his tactical incompetence, continued to alienate both officers and the men alike. So here we go. He's making people, whenever they do something wrong, he makes them dig a 6 foot by 6 foot hole just at the end of the day to tell them to fill it back up. And through all this, one of the things that they talk about in the book is Sobel is not the most physically fit guy. And when they put him in the military exercises, he's always getting lost. He can't read a map. He's not great at doing a lot of the actual tactical work that the infantry soldiers need to be doing, or the airborne soldiers need to be doing. So the people are losing respect for him on that front, as well as when he's just blowing up on the guys for no reason. So Sobel's leadership is kind of all going to come to a head, or this one culminating moment, while they are in the UK. And what's going to end up happening is Sobel, who's number one in command of Easy Company, is going to end up court-martialing Dick Winters, who is number two in command. So obviously that's not a good situation. On October 30th, Lieutenant Colonel Strayer was scheduled to inspect Easy Company. Sobel issued me orders to inspect the latrine at 10 a.m., 1 hour before Strayer was due to arrive. At 9:30, I also received orders from battalion headquarters to censor the enlisted men's mail. I completed that chore, and at 10, I promptly entered the latrine. To my surprise, Sobel was already there, making his own inspection. Without uttering a word, he exited the latrine, walked by me without acknowledging my presence. Behind him walked Private Mello, the latrine orderly, wet mop in hand. Mello was soaking wet, dirty, and in need of a shave, hair uncombed. He looked, and I'm sure felt, like a man who had just finished doing a dirty job. Sobel left without saying a word. I proceeded with my personal inspection and found that Mello had done a superb job. When I walked to the company headquarters 45 minutes later, First Sergeant Evans handed me a typed document that demanded my reply by endorsement whether I desired company punishment for failure to inspect the latrine at 9:45 a.m. as instructed by the company commander, or whether I requested a court-martial. So he's getting handed this document that says, do you want company punishment, or do you want to be court-martialed for disobeying the order of being at the latrine at 9:45 a.m.? So that is the situation that Dick Winters is in. He's got this first sergeant handing him this paper saying, hey, you disobeyed a direct order. Do you want company punishment, or do you want to go have a court-martial? Back to the book. It says, I immediately proceeded to Sobel's office to clear up the misunderstanding. So that's a good move. Just go directly there to talk it out in person. We can kind of remember that note for ourselves today. If you've got a moment like this, it's probably better not to text it out or put it on Slack, where there can be a lot of misinterpretation. Try to have that conversation face to face. So that's what Dick Winters is doing. He's walking straight to Sobel's office to clear up this misunderstanding. Back to the book. Captain, my orders were to inspect the latrine at 10 a.m. I changed that time to 9:45, Sobel replied. I was not informed of that change. I telephoned and sent a runner, Sobel said. This was too much for me. Just another example of the chicken shit that characterized Sobel's tenure as Easy Company's commanding officer. So Dick Winters is going to end up requesting the court-martial instead of the company punishment. And long story short, the non-commissioned officers within Easy Company end up having a mutiny against Sobel, and they demand, or they were requesting / demanding that Dick Winters come back to Easy Company, because whenever he's court-martialed, he's removed from Easy Company for that time, because you can't have, the number one guy court-martialing the number two guy and keep both of them in command of the same company. So whenever the court-martial happens, they remove Dick Winters, and then the non-commissioned officers within Easy Company have a mutiny against Sobel and request that they bring Dick Winters back to be a leader within Easy Company. So that's just some good lessons. Like I said, studying Sobel and kind of doing an inversion on how to not be a good leader could be a whole podcast within itself. I just touched on a few of the stories from the book, but it's a really interesting part of the book and also of the TV series to watch and think about, hey, all of these things that lose you leadership capital. Sobel is a very good example for us to understand a lot of the different actions that you can take that will end up losing you leadership capital. All right, so now we're going to move on from Sobel, and we're going to start learning some of the lessons of leadership from Dick Winters. Here we go. This is a story from while they were training in the UK still. This is Dick Winters talking. He says, Compton was an energetic officer whom I later chastised about gambling with the men. An officer should never put himself in a position where he takes anything from the men, never abuse them by act or omission. As a commander, a leader must be prepared to give everything, including himself, to the people he leads. You give your time and you strive to be consistently fair, never demonstrating favoritism. In my opinion, Compton had jeopardized his position as a leader by establishing an improper relationship with some of his troopers. Compton did not take the counseling seriously, but I felt it my duty to ensure that he understood my feelings on maintaining a professional relationship with the soldiers in his platoon. So there's two things that stuck out to me as I read this lesson from Dick Winters. The first is this idea of professional distance. And I heard this term from Admiral William McRaven. We've covered him on the podcast before. I believe it was podcast number 8. He wrote Wisdom of the Bullfrog. He was a Navy SEAL, led a lot of the special operations missions from Captain Phillips to killing Osama bin Laden in Operation Neptune Spear. Just a fantastic guy. But he talks about this concept of professional distance, and that is the distance that you are as a leader from your men. And he talks about how, you can't be too close to your men, like in this case what Dick Winters is talking about, where Compton is an officer who's so close with the men that he feels okay gambling with them and taking money from them, right? That's what Dick Winters is saying. You can never be in a position where you are taking something from the men. Compton was too close in his professional distance. He did not have enough professional distance from the guys. But also, one of the things that Admiral McRaven talks about is how you can't be too far removed from the guys either. They have to know that you care about them. They have to see you there with them on the front line. So dialing in that correct professional distance is something that's not easy to do. And so when I read this story, that's one of the things that I'm seeing is, hey, here's an example of a situation where, in Dick Winters' opinion, this officer has not created enough professional distance. He's still too close to the men. The second thing that this made me think of is toward the end there, Dick Winters says, Compton did not take my counseling seriously, but I felt it my duty to ensure that he understood my feelings on maintaining a professional relationship with the soldiers in his platoon. And I think that's a really interesting thing to note, is that, hey, this leader under me is not taking my counsel seriously. He's not listening to everything I say. And this is something Jocko talks about all the time, is how people aren't robots. People just aren't going to immediately take your advice or recommendations or orders as a leader and implement them. And we see Dick Winters talking about that right here. Even though he's telling Compton that he shouldn't be gambling with the men, Compton is not taking that counseling seriously. So just an important thing to remember, that there, as a leader, there's the battles that you have to, you're gonna have to pick your battles with the guys on which ones you're gonna die on, like which hills you're gonna die on, and which things you see as like, hey, I'm gonna make this recommendation, but at the end, I'm not going to expend all of my leadership capital to stop this thing from going on. So it's really interesting just to see that comment from Dick Winters talking about how, in this case, even though Dick Winters was counseling his leader and telling him how to be a good leader, that Compton was not taking that counseling seriously. So just some interesting thoughts there. Moving on a little bit in the book, they are about to get on the planes to fly into Normandy. So I thought it was just fascinating to kind of read what the mental state of Easy Company was as they were about to go and execute this invasion of Normandy. So here we go, diving in on the book. He says the mental state of the company was best described in the regimental journal as a mood of sober expectancy. No one was jubilant, but no one wanted to be left out. Everyone wondered what the jump and the hours following would be like, but every trooper was confident of his own ability to meet the unknown situation. So I thought that was really interesting, that line, that each trooper was confident in his own ability to meet the unknown situation. This reminded me of, from Sam Walton's book, Made in America. He talks about how in high school he never lost a football game, and how he kind of ended up with this, you can call it confidence, or this idea that he was going to win. Like his default was like, I'm going to win, and that's how I think. And so when I read this line that, hey, Easy Company had a sober expectancy, but they expected that they were going to win, they were confident in their ability to meet this unknown situation, I thought that was really interesting to see that mental state from the guys of Easy Company. And if we skip forward a little bit, Dick Winters writes, most of us were just thinking good and hard about the mission at hand and how we would fare in our initial contact with the enemy. My only concern was whether or not I would let my men down once we entered combat. There we go again. He talks about that fear that drove him to become a good leader. His fear is that he would let his men down in combat, that he would not make the right decisions, that he would fold under that pressure. That is what he is fearful of. Back to the book. It says, as a fighting company, the men were primed and ready to go, and we fully intended that we were either going to win the ensuing battle or be killed. Like I said, that just reminds me of Sam Walton. He's saying here, we expected to win the battle or be killed. That is the mentality that we are going into Normandy with. The next story we're going to dive into is a little bit further in the book. So like I said, we're going to be skipping major parts of the book, buy the audiobook, check it out. It's worth the time to hear the full context of these stories. But one of the things that Easy Company does is they end up taking out 4 German guns at Brecourt Manor. And it's one of the kind of most studied assaults in military history. It's like a textbook assault that Easy Company executes when they take out these German guns. And one of the things that Dick Winters talks about is how, as a leader, to execute that, how he puts the guys that he knows are killers in certain places to make sure that they execute the mission well. So here we go, diving in on the book. It says, at long last, D-Day was over. Our success had been due to superb leadership at all levels and the training we had experienced prior to the invasion. I love that, right? He's saying that we were successful in this assault because of the leadership we had before and all of the training we did in the years building up to this moment. Back to the book. Add luck to the equation, and Easy Company comprised a formidable team. On reflection, we were highly charged, we knew what to do, and we conducted ourselves as part of a well-oiled machine. Because we were so intimate with each other, I knew the strengths of each of my troopers. That's an important line. That's what he's saying. Because we spent so long training together, I knew the strengths of each of my troopers. This is something that I read about from Rockefeller in his letters to his son, and I think it's in the effective executive book as well by Peter Drucker. They talk about how you need to understand the strengths of the people on your team, but also double down on their strengths. You don't want to focus on the weaknesses of the people on the team. You want to look for and identify their strengths and double down on those. And that's what Dick Winters is saying here. He says, I knew the strengths of the guys on my team. Back to the book. Because we were so intimate with each other, I knew the strengths of each of my troopers. It was not accidental that I'd selected my best men, Compton, Grenier, and Malarkey in one group, Limpton and Renee in the other. These men comprised of Easy Company's killers, soldiers who instinctively understood the intricacies of battle. In both training and combat, a leader senses who his killers are. I merely put them in a position where I could utilize their talents most effectively. That's the thing that Rockefeller hit on as well. What are the people's strengths, and where can I put these people to where their strengths turn into outstanding talent? That's what Dick Winters is saying here. I merely put them in a position where I could utilize their talents most effectively. Many other soldiers thought they were killers and wanted to prove it. In reality, however, your killers are few and far between, nor is it always possible to determine who your killers are by the results of a single engagement. In combat, a company commander hopes that non-killers will learn by their association with the soldiers who instinctively wage war without restraint and without regard for their personal safety. The problem, of course, lies in the fact that casualties are highest among your killers, hence the need to return them to the front as soon as possible and hope that other killers emerge. All right, skipping forward to another story from the book. Easy Company ends up in this town called Caratan, and there's a battle that occurs at this intersection. If you've seen the HBO miniseries, it's the one moment, and Dick Winters talks about it in the book, where he literally had to get up and kick his soldiers in the ass to get them moving. There's, I think, 2 German machine gun positions that are shooting at the American guys, and a lot of the guys are kind of hiding along either side of the road, and Dick Winters is trying to get the guys up and get them moving so that they can, move forward and get on offense. And there's this really interesting story that's kind of right after the action from Dick Winters. Here we go, diving in on the book. It says, in taking the intersection, Easy Company sustained 10 casualties. Among our wounded were Sergeant Lipton, Ed Tipper, and Burr Smith. Another casualty was Private Albert Blythe, who was in the aid station sitting with his back against the wall when I entered to have my wound cleaned. I did not notice any wounds, so I asked, "How are you doing, Blythe?" I can't see, he replied. I remember trying to comfort him by saying, "It's okay, Blythe, relax. They'll soon have you out of here, and they'll send you back to England." As I started to move away, Blythe stood up, saying suddenly, I'm okay. I can see now." As soon as Blythe regained his vision, he immediately returned to duty. If you think about that for a minute, that boy had been paralyzed by fear, yet he had the guts and dedication to stick to his buddies in easy company. As soon as he relaxed and pulled himself together, he returned to the front rather than taking the easy way out with an evacuation. Sometimes all a soldier needed was a calm voice reassuring him that everything was fine. And as I read this story from Dick Winters and as I think about it, I'm reminded of this story that Jocko tells. And I couldn't find the podcast where he originally tells it, but he talks about this situation where when he's in Ramadi in 2006 and some situation goes sideways. I don't remember exactly what happened. I don't know if it was a blue on blue incident or what exactly happened, but he talks about how he goes into one of the office of a guy higher up in the chain of command. And he's curious to see how this guy's reacting to this terrible situation that's going on or this bad situation. And Jocko says that this leader is sitting there and calmly says, "Hey, you've got to expect these types of things to happen." And Jocko talks about the impact that it had on him, being like, "Oh, shoot, like this guy is able to keep his composure in this situation. All of these things are going wrong or things going bad. This is a really bad situation that we are in. And here we are. And I can see the leader in this calm voice saying, you've got to expect these types of things to happen." And Jocko talks about the impact that had on him and how it made him feel that, things were maybe not under control, but this is a normal thing to happen. And so when I think about the story of, saying things in a calm voice and the leader having a calm voice and the importance of that in these moments, that was one of the first stories that kind of came to mind for me. And I'm also reminded of a personal story of mine is from early on in my career, probably my first year of working out of college. I was on a ride along with a sales exec from our company. He was the most seasoned sales exec on our team, and he was absolutely incredible at the job. And we had this situation where when I was on a ride along with him, we were sitting across the table from one of our customers who was extremely upset. I don't exactly remember what it was about, but upset enough to where he was getting visibly heated and about to, like, he was raising his voice and about to start shouting at us. And in that moment, as the tension is building, this sales exec just very calmly says, "Hey, this seems like it's not the best time for us to have this conversation. How about we leave and I come back tomorrow or in a few days and we can revisit this conversation?" And he just stands up and we slowly said goodbye and walked out of the building and, ended up following up with him a few days later and everything, the whole tension level came down and everything came down. But it just was a great example for me of someone being able to keep their composure in what for me was a very tense situation, right? And I think about the calm voice that he had as this client, as this customer was getting very heated, and how that sales executive was able to remain calm in that situation and the impact that had on me. And I'm sure the impact that it had on the customer as well. So those are just some of the stories that I think about when I read the story from Dick Winters about the importance of having a calm voice and how sometimes a calm voice is all the soldier needs to hear. All right, moving on, skipping forward a little bit in the book. So after the invasion of Normandy, they end up flying back to the UK for a few months. And there was really just interesting note that Dick Winters writes about how leadership is and can be a lonely job. Here we go, diving on the book. It says, "As for myself, I relaxed as best as I could. Combat had made me tense, particularly since my decisions now meant life or death to the members of my command." And this is something we see over and over again, right? He's thinking about this a lot. He's thinking about the burden of his leadership. He's thinking about the fact that his decisions mean the life and death of the members of his command. back to the book. Commanding soldiers in combat requires a personal detachment from the men themselves. Back to that idea of detaching from the men and that professional distance. In a sense, command is the loneliest job in the world. Looking at myself in the mirror, I could see how much I had changed. I could sense it. So, just one of those ideas. That's something that I had heard before I ended up becoming a CEO, is how being a CEO can be a very lonely job. I actually think there's a lot of this aspects of it that are not lonely at all. I definitely wouldn't say it's the loneliest job in the world. I think there's much more lonely jobs. But obviously, being a CEO is nowhere near the same situation as being a commander or a leader in a military unit where your decisions literally mean life and death for the men beneath you. Skipping forward in the book, I wanted to touch on this moment where Dick Winters is going to recommend one of his guys for a promotion because the guy's what he calls a can-do man. And I just love the description. The guy's name is Deal, who he is recommending for a promotion. Here we go, diving in on the book. It says Deal was by no means the biggest, strongest, or toughest guy in the outfit. He was not an athlete, but he possessed a command voice and a command attitude, and he took no backtalk or guff from any soldier. He was what I called a can-do man. Give him an order and you could forget about it. He'll get the job done. He was the kind of soldier who made any outfit look good, and he made a platoon's leader's job easy. Deal is also a self-starter, highly motivated, entirely dependable, and he had a no-nonsense, low-key leadership style that commanded the respect of the men. So I just love that description of what he calls a can-do man. You know, someone who can just be given an order and then the leader can just forget about it and move on. One of the words he uses in there, he says, Deal was entirely dependable. That reminds me of Charlie Munger. He uses the word reliable, same word or same idea as being dependable. Charlie Munger talks about how if you are reliable, it's almost hard to be unsuccessful in this life. And I think that fits perfectly with this idea of being a can-do man and being someone who can just be given a task or a problem and who can go figure that thing out. When I was reading this section, one of the things I was reminded of there's this guy named Keith Rabwa, and he was part of the PayPal mafia. So worked with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel at PayPal, and is also an investor. And there's this clip of him, and he talks about he's essentially talking about types of people, right? So Dick Winters here is talking about can-do man. Keith Rabwal talks about cannons versus ammunition, and he's talking about how as a leader you want to get as many cannons on your team as possible. He talks about ammunition are really the people who will do what they're told to do, but they're not going to drive something from conception all the way through completion, whereas a cannon is someone who you can just give an idea or give them a goal, and that's the last thing you have to do, right? They're going to take the initiative, they're going to fill in the gaps, and they're going to report back to you as the leader. And that's what Dick Winters is saying. It makes the leader's job easy when you have these people who are can-do men or who are the cannons, right? So kind of one of the takeaways for me is if you are trying to move up in an organization, if you're trying to be successful within an organization, be a can-do man, be reliable, be highly motivated, be a self-starter, be these things that Dick Winters and Keith Rabwa are describing, and that's going to lead you down a path to be successful. All right, moving forward in the book, we're going to jump to the Battle of the Bulge. So the Battle of the Bulge is one of the really, most probably well-known battles of World War II. It's in Belgium. It's in December of 1944 through January of 1945, and it's depicted in the miniseries. It's the scenes where they're in the middle of the forest in the middle of the winter. It's 10 to 25 degrees during the day, and it's below freezing at night. It's below 0 degrees Fahrenheit at night, so extremely cold. And the guys in Easy Company do not have winter gear, so they're there for 30 days in this frigid cold in the middle of the forest under enemy fire and with artillery shells coming down all the time. It's just a wild scenario to imagine yourself being exposed to. And there's some fantastic lessons from Dick Winters from the Battle of the Bulge. So here we go, diving in on the book. It says, as the weather further deteriorated, physical exhaustion combined with mental fatigue to produce an unusually high number of casualties now classified as combat exhaustion or battle fatigue. In Normandy, I had witnessed lots of stress, some in Holland, but much more at Bastogne due to the cold, lack of sleep, and constant artillery bombardment. So here he's talking about how much combat exhaustion and battle fatigue they are seeing that's leading to all of these casualties in Easy Company. He's going to tell us what is leading to that exhaustion and battle fatigue. Here we go. I'm not sure that anybody who lived through Bastogne hasn't carried with him in some hidden ways the scars of fatigue. Perhaps that is a factor that keeps the 101st paratroopers bonded so unusually close. In virtually every case, the men had been on the front line for extended periods since D-Day. They were now completely exhausted. They had no hot food, little sleep, no rest, constant tension, and the pressure of combat. The worst time was night, when temperatures plummeted and fog covered the battlefield until late morning. The uncertainty of what lay just yards ahead in the next tree line was sufficient to break ordinary men. Not surprisingly, the men became physically exhausted. And here he's going to talk about what that physical exhaustion leads to. Back to the book. Physical exhaustion leads to mental exhaustion, which in turn causes men to lose discipline. So that's really important. He's saying physical exhaustion is going to lead to mental exhaustion, and then that is going to lead to the men losing discipline. Back to the book. Loss of self-discipline then produces combat fatigue. Self-discipline keeps a soldier doing his job. Without it, he loses pride and he loses the importance of self-respect in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. It is pride that keeps a soldier going and keeps him in the fight. That is what I feared I would lose. The loss of the will to measure up to my men. Here we go. He's saying it again. This fear is what is driving him, and that is what is helping him maintain the discipline and keep his self-respect, is that he is fighting to keep his will to measure up to his men. Back to the book. After seeing others break down, you wondered who was next, and you started taking a hard look at yourself. I often wondered why I didn't break under the strain of combat. One fact undoubtedly lay in the fact that my battalion headquarters lay 75 yards behind the forward foxholes. No longer was I under enemy observation. Consequently, I was able to concentrate on my duties without fear of enemy small arms fire. Another factor was undoubtedly my physical conditioning. I don't think there was a man in the battalion who was in better physical shape than I was. My responsibility to ensure the safety of the soldiers had also hardened me to cope with the daily stress of combat. So this is just super interesting, seeing his kind of chain of how he's saying that physical exhaustion leads to mental exhaustion, and mental exhaustion leads to a loss of discipline. And when a soldier loses his self-discipline, he loses his self-respect, and that is the chain that is going to lead to combat fatigue for these guys. And he also talks about how that first block in the chain is physical exhaustion. That reminds me of this line from the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And a lot of people talk about it, but one of the lines in there is he talks about how we don't have time to not work out. We don't have time to not keep ourselves physically in shape. And it's really interesting to see here that Dick Winters has that as kind of the first thing that happens. Is physical exhaustion is the first kind of domino in the series that ends up leading to combat fatigue. Back to the book. One last observation on combat fatigue. When you see a man break, he usually slams his helmet down and messes up his hair. I don't know if it's conscious or unconscious, but a soldier goes to his head and massages his head, shakes it, and then he's gone. You can talk to him all you want, but he cannot hear you. When he reaches that point, the best thing for everybody is to just let him take a walk. Combat exhaustion occurs instantaneously. You don't plan to become a combat fatigue casualty. That's super interesting. He talks about how combat fatigue or combat exhaustion just happens instantaneously. And I remember, when Jocko was going through his podcast on this book, talking about Dick Winters and talking about a few other books, one of the things that he saw over and over in the books that he was reading about these military campaigns is this idea that when, the men stop taking care of themselves. Here he talks about how the men will take off their helmets and they'll start messing with their hair, right? That moment when people start taking off their helmets or they stop shaving is the moment that they are losing that self-discipline and things are about to go sideways. It was really interesting hearing Jocko talk about that on a series of podcasts he was doing. And we see that here. Back to the book. This is back to Dick Winters talking. How do you prevent combat fatigue? So here we go. As a leader, what can we do to prevent combat fatigue from happening? He says you talk to your troops and make some excuse to pull a soldier off the front line. Of course, pulling a soldier off the front line increases the stress of those who remain, but it is a necessary trade-off. I often asked a soldier who I saw on the verge of a breakdown, hey, how about coming back with me to the CP to help out for a couple of days? In this manner, you invent a reason for pulling a guy from the line without damaging his psyche. Joseph Liebgott was a case in point. Liebgott was a very good combat soldier who had proven himself in Normandy and Holland. At Bastogne, the stress began to catch up to him, so I brought him back to my command post to be my runner for a few days, to let him rest up, to get away from the tension of being on the front, and after a few days, he wanted to return to the front line to join his buddies. So that whole section on just combat fatigue, what leads to combat fatigue, and how to prevent combat fatigue, I thought was just a really fascinating lesson from Dick Winters. And this next part is still kind of touching from the same point of the book, from the Battle of Bastogne. And he's going to talk about how he would shave and bathe in front of the men to show that he's maintaining his self-discipline and show the guys that he intends to be there for the long term and it's not as bad as they think it is. So here we go. Back to the book. That was one of the things I did to set an example for the men. Shave in the morning, and once in a while, I would strip to the waist and give myself a French wash, a routine that also caught everyone's attention. So it's freezing cold outside. He's taking his shirt off in front of the guys. He's shaving his face, and he's giving himself a bath with water in the freezing cold. But he's talking about how he's doing this to set an example for the men. I did this for one reason and one reason only, to get the men's attention and to let them know that I was going to be around for a while and that this wasn't as bad as they thought it was going to be. So make the best of it. So as I read this kind of reminds me of Jocko's good analogy and this idea of, just taking any situation and looking at the good of it. And he's talking about here, Dick Winters is saying, hey, this isn't as bad as you guys think it is. We're going to make the best of it. It also kind of reminds me of this idea of aligning your expectations with reality. If your expectations is aligned with reality, you're not going to feel as miserable. And so that's what he's saying is, hey, guys, this isn't as bad as we think it's going to be. Make the best of it. Now, that said, Dick Winters is saying this is a crazy situation where they're literally in the middle of a war. They're under enemy fire. They're hiding in foxholes. They're getting trench foot. I mean, this is a brutal situation. So I say all these things, and Dick Winters is saying these things. I mean, this is, I feel like, case in point of easier said than done, or, these ideas are simple, but they're not easy. The fact that Dick Winters is doing this in the middle of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge is just really interesting to see that these are kind of the leadership tactics that he's employing to keep the morale and motivation and the self-discipline of his guys up through the Battle of Bastogne. All right, moving forward to the next lesson. This is still from the Battle of Bastogne. Here we go, diving in the book. It says, the intensity of artillery fire over a protracted period has a dramatic impact on a combat unit. Just as soon as the last rounds fall, as a leader, you must begin circulating among the men. Is everybody okay? Let's get up. Let's move. Keep your eyes open for an attack. Get the men's attention. And moving among your men, the very fact that they see you and they are talking to you, they know that you are there, and it makes all the difference in the world to realize they are not in this by themselves. As I read this and as I'm thinking right now, I'm reminded of Elon Musk sleeping on the floor of the Tesla Gigafactory as they're trying to complete that surge and get the Gigafactory up and running and making 5,000 cars a week, right? He talks about the impact that had on the guys, that they knew that Elon Musk was there with them trying to push through and get this thing done. That's the same thing that Dick Winters is saying here, is that when your men see you moving amongst them, it makes all the difference in the world that they realize that they are not in this by themselves. Back to the book. Even if a soldier remains fixed on his own feelings and his own fear, and if his leader is moving among the men, the soldier realizes that the leader is sharing the same hardship he himself is experiencing. Then and only then will a soldier be able to move. So, like I said, I mean, that reminds me of Elon Musk, chesty puller. That was something we heard from him a lot. one of the most famous Marines of all time. Jocko Willink, who I reference all the time, I've referenced on this podcast several times. His company is called Echelon Front for a reason. They are the guys in the front. As a leader, you need to be in the front with the guys in the trenches so that the guys know that you're there and they know that you are in the fight with them. The next lesson, we're going to be skipping forward in the book, and this is going to be when Easy Company comes across their first concentration camp. So this is a scene that's also included in the HBO miniseries. And obviously, when you think about World War II and you think about Europe and Germany in World War II, one of the things that a lot of us will know from history is the concentration camps that the Germans had built. And so this story is going to come from when Easy Company comes across their first concentration camp. Diving down the book, it says, by now the men and I were seasoned combat veterans, but the sights we witnessed when we arrived at the camp defied description. The horror of what we observed remains with each paratrooper to this day. You could not explain it, you could not describe it, and you could not exaggerate it. It did not take long to realize that the Nazis were intent on eliminating all the Jews, gypsies, and anyone who disagreed with Hitler's regime. The memory of starved, dazed men who dropped their eyes and heads when we looked at them through the chain link fence in the same manner that a beaten, mistreated dog would cringe left a mark on all of us forever. Nor could you underestimate the barbarity of the Nazi regime, even during the latter stages of the war. I immediately directed Nixon to take all the local inhabitants to clean up the camp, including the crematorium and the burial pits. As I went through the war, it was natural to ask myself, why am I here? Why am I putting up with the freezing cold, the constant rain, the loss of so many comrades? Does anybody care? A soldier faces death on a daily basis, and his life is one of misery and deprivation. He is cold, he suffers from hunger, frequently bordering on starvation. The impact of seeing those people behind that fence left me saying, if only to myself, now I know why I am here. For the first time, I understand what this war is all about. So that was just really powerful part of the book where Dick Winters talks about how, as a soldier, you question why you're doing this thing, why you're putting in all this effort. I'm cold, I'm hungry, I'm hurting. No one seems to care about me. Does anybody care about this thing? And he talks about this moment where he comes across the concentration camp for the first time and realizes why they were fighting this war and what it meant. So I thought that was just, obviously you hear all the time the importance of knowing why you're doing what you're doing. And, there's books that we'll probably cover on this podcast, like Man's Search for Meaning, which is actually a story written by a guy who survived the concentration camp, but just really cool to see from Dick Winters' perspective of like, hey, we went through all these things, but it was 100% worth it. And this is why. Moving forward, I touched on this at the beginning. The last chapter of the book is called Reflections, and it's where Dick Winters just dives into the leadership lessons that he learns. We've already touched on a lot of the key lessons in there. We talked about knowing what to expect from each man. And there's a really good part in Reflections where he talks about that. So we'll read that real quick. He says, I've always felt that my principal contribution to the success of both Easy Company and 2nd Battalion was based on my knowledge of knowing what to expect from each man. So that's super interesting. He says, my principal contribution as the leader was knowing what to expect from each man in the company. And we talked about earlier how you have to know who your killers are. Back to the book, it was hardly accidental that I selected Easy's killers for the assault on the battery at Epicor. Having selected the right men for the job, I then delegated the authority to my subordinates. So that's something we hear all the time. Again, delegating authority. Jocko would call it decentralized command. A lot of people talk about delegating. We've talked about that from Sam Walton. We've talked about that from Rockefeller. We've talked about that from a lot of people. Back to the book, I then delegated the authority to my subordinates and allowed them to use their initiative to execute the mission. There's no need to tell someone how to do his job if you have properly trained your team. So I just love that idea of his principal contribution being knowing the strengths of each man and what each one of them could contribute and what to expect from each person in the organization. And then the last one I wanted to touch on, and we've talked about it many times today already, is just this idea that feeling fear is natural, and it's something that Dick Winters felt throughout his entire time leading men in battle. Back to the book. It says, I always felt that my position was where the critical decision had to be made, nor am I ashamed to admit that fear was a principal factor that contributed to my success as a leader. I was always afraid of letting my men down, and I was always afraid of dying. It was a combination of those fears that drove me to learn everything I could about my profession so I could bring as many of my men home from the war as possible. So, like we talked about, that idea that fear of letting his men down and not bringing guys back home was what led Dick Winters to become the leader that he became, and that ended up leading Easy Company to become one of the most historic military units in American history. So that's where we're going to close out this podcast. Thank you, Dick Winters, for writing this book, Beyond the Band of Brothers. Dick Winters has passed away already, so he's no longer with us, but luckily we have the book Band of Brothers. We have Dick Winters' memoirs to look back on and capture some of those lessons learned. So with that, we'll close out the podcast, and thanks for listening.